What happens when a lonely woman, who has accepted a life of solitude, receives a proposition that is as cold as the prairie wind, yet holds the promise of a future she'd only dared to dream of? Could a marriage born of pure necessity, a simple contract between two isolated souls, ever blossom into the kind of love that legends are made of? This is the story of a resilient school teacher and a powerful, silent rancher, a man whose heart was as vast and untamed as the land he commanded. Theirs was an arrangement, a bargain struck against the harsh backdrop of the Wild West, a union that would be tested by greed, violence, and the ghosts of the past. Stay with us to discover how a practical agreement, designed to secure a legacy, unearths a love powerful enough to build a new one. And if their story touches your heart, please consider subscribing and liking this video to help us share more tales of courage and unlikely romance. The proposition arrived with the dust of the trail, carried on the shoulders of a man who seemed carved from the very rock and timber of the unforgiving western landscape. Gideon Blackwood did not knock on the door of Amelia Vance's small schoolhouse. His presence was an announcement in itself, a shadow that fell across her slate and momentarily dimmed the afternoon sun. Amelia, a woman who had long since made her peace with a solitary life, looked up from her lesson plans, her heart giving a single, hard thump against her ribs. She was 32, a widow whose brief, youthful marriage had ended in heartbreak and disillusionment, leaving her with an unyielding independence and a quiet, well-ordered existence. Here, in the small town of Redemption, she was respected, needed, but ultimately alone. Gideon Blackwood was a legend in these parts, a man who owned more land than most men had ever walked, a figure of immense power and deeper silence. It was said his grief for his late father had walled him off from the world, leaving him to preside over his empire with a grim, solitary focus. He stood in her doorway, his massive frame making the entrance seem small, his eyes the color of a stormy sky. His words were as blunt and unadorned as a fence post. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice a low rumble. "I have a proposal. I require a wife to manage my home and to provide an heir for this land. You are a respectable woman, without family ties. I can offer you security, a fine home, and my name. In return, I would ask for a son." The words hung in the still air, stripped of all romance, a transaction of stark and brutal practicality. He was not offering his heart, he was offering a contract, a fortress against the loneliness they both knew so well, and Amelia felt the quiet world she had so carefully constructed begin to tremble. Amelia spent the next 3 days in a state of suspended reality, the echo of Gideon's words disrupting the familiar rhythms of her life. The scratching of chalk on slate, the recitation of multiplication tables, the lonely ritual of her evening tea, all of it now seemed fragile, a temporary shelter against the vastness of the life he offered. She weighed his proposition as one might weigh grain, measuring the heavy certainty of her current solitude against the terrifying, unknown potential of his world. She remembered the betrayal that had first driven her west, the sharp, cruel pain of a love that had proven false, and the vow she had made to never again place her heart in another's keeping. Yet, as she looked out the schoolhouse window at the endless sea of grass, a deeper loneliness ached within her, a yearning for a human connection that her books and her students could never fully satisfy. On the 4th day, she walked the 2 miles to the Blackwood Ranch. He met her on the porch, his expression unreadable. "I will accept your proposal," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "On one condition. The schoolhouse remains my own. My work, my independence, is not part of this bargain." A flicker of something, respect, perhaps, passed through his stoic eyes. He simply nodded. Agreed. Their return to town to see the preacher was met with a flurry of shocked whispers and unveiled stares. The women at the general store fell silent as she entered, their gossip hanging in the air like dust motes. The judgment was a palpable force, pressing in on them, forcing them to define the space between them. On the ride back to the ranch, as husband and wife, an unspoken understanding passed between them. In the eyes of the world, they had to be a unit, a fortress of two. The Blackwood Ranch house was a testament to its owner, immense, solid, and impeccably maintained, yet utterly devoid of warmth. It was a place of echoing silences and Spartan utility, a home that had long forgotten the sound of laughter. In their first weeks together, Amelia and Gideon moved around each other like polite, wary ghosts. He was unfailingly respectful, granting her a wide berth, his presence a constant, silent weight in the vast rooms. He worked from sunup to sundown, a man driven by a relentless purpose she did not yet understand. He spoke little, his character revealed not in words, but in the gentle way he handled a newborn calf, the unyielding integrity with which he treated his ranch hands. The change began subtly. One evening, driven by the oppressive quiet, Amelia followed a sliver of lamplight to his study. She expected to find him hunched over ledgers, but instead, he was lost in a worn volume of poetry, his large, calloused finger tracing the lines with a surprising reverence. It was the first glimpse of the hidden depths beneath his formidable exterior. Emboldened, Amelia began her quiet campaign to breathe life into the house. She filled a vase with fiery Indian paintbrush from the prairie, their vibrant color a defiant splash against the dark wood. The scent of fresh-baked bread began to fill the sterile air. She brought her books from the schoolhouse, creating a small library in the parlor. Slowly, imperceptibly, the house began to feel less like a fortress and more like a home, and the space between them began to shrink. Their first necessary trip into redemption as a married couple was an ordeal of public scrutiny. As they walked down the dusty main street, Amelia could feel the weight of every curious gaze, hear the whispers that trailed in their wake. She held herself ramrod straight, her teacher's composure her only shield. As they neared the mercantile, Gideon, without a word, reached out and placed his large, warm hand on the small of her back. The gesture was a simple act of public solidarity, a performance for the town, but for Amelia, it was a brand. A current of unexpected heat shot through her, startling in its intensity. It was the first time he had touched her with anything resembling intimacy, and it anchored her in the swirling currents of gossip. This small pretense began to build a fragile bridge between them. A partnership, forged in the public eye, began to take root in private. He started leaving a cup of hot coffee for her on the stove each morning. She found herself watching for his return from the fields in the evening. When a fierce storm tore shingles from the schoolhouse roof, he was there the next day, hammer in hand, his silent competence a balm to her anxieties. She, in turn, began mending his work clothes, the simple act of putting a needle through his coarse shirt feeling like a stitch being taken in the fabric of their own fractured lives. The lines between the arrangement and genuine companionship began to blur, their shared silences becoming comfortable, their brief exchanges charged with an unspoken, growing awareness of one another. The arrival of Marcus Thorne shattered their burgeoning peace. He rode in on a fine black horse, dressed in a tailored city suit that was an affront to the rugged landscape. His smile was polished and predatory, his eyes holding a cold, calculating light. Thorne was a spectre from Gideon's past, a man whose family had a long and bitter history with the Blackwoods. He dismounted with an air of arrogant ownership and produced a rolled-up deed. "Blackwood," he said, his voice smooth and laced with venom, "it seems this land, specifically the spring that feeds your entire northern range, was improperly deeded to your father. According to this document, it belongs to my estate." The document felt like a death sentence to the ranch. Without that water, hundreds of cattle would be lost, and the foundation of Gideon's empire would crumble. An old, familiar darkness settled over Gideon, shuttering his expression and pulling him back into the cold, silent fortress of his grief. Amelia saw it instantly. This was more than a legal dispute, it was a deeply personal wound. The threat was not just to their home or their livelihood, it was an attack on Gideon's very soul, a desecration of the legacy his father had died to protect. The silence in the house returned, but this time it was not awkward, it was heavy, suffocating, and filled with the ghosts of a history she was not yet privy to, a past that now threatened to destroy their fragile, unpoken future. While Gideon retreated into a grim, stoic silence, consumed by the fight for his land, Amelia's methodical, schoolteacher's mind went to work. She could not stand by while the foundation of their new life was threatened. With Gideon's tacit permission, she unlocked the heavy oak chest that contained the Blackwood family papers. For days, she sorted through brittle documents, faded letters, and old county maps, her meticulous nature perfectly suited to the task. She spent hours at the county clerk's office, cross-referencing deeds and land grants, the dust of the archive settling on her shoulders like a shroud. Then, she found it. A discrepancy in the signature on a copy of the deed Thorne held, a slight tremor in the ink that was absent from Gideon's father's other official documents. It was small, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt. The true revelation, however, came that night, tucked away in a leather-bound journal. It was a letter from Gideon's father, written in his final months, detailing how Marcus Thorne's father had used threats and financial ruin to swindle him, a betrayal that had broken his spirit and hastened his death. The truth was suddenly, brutally clear. This was not a dispute over water rights, it was the final act of a generational crime. Thorne was not just trying to steal their land, he was trying to complete the destruction his father had started, to erase the Blackwood legacy from the earth out of pure, spiteful greed. The stakes had been raised from property to justice, from a legal battle to a moral war. Amelia laid the journal and the forged deed on the heavy oak table in Gideon's study. She watched as he read his father's words, his massive shoulders slumping under the weight of the old, bitter truth. A storm of rage and grief gathered in his eyes, and his first instinct was to protect her. "You will pack a bag and go to the pastor's wife in town," he stated, his voice flat and final. "You will stay there until this is over." It was a command, meant to shield her, but it felt like a dismissal. Amelia felt a surge of indignation. She had not come this far, had not invested her heart in this man and this life, only to be sidelined when the true battle began. "No," she said, her own voice quiet but unyielding. "I am your wife, Gideon. I signed onto this life, the good and the bad. Your fight is my fight." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, the walls around his heart seemed to crumble completely. He saw not a fragile woman to be protected, but a partner of immense strength and resolve. A slow nod was his only reply. The next morning, he did not take her to town. He took her to the barn, and from a locked chest, he retrieved a sleek, heavy rifle. With painstaking patience, he taught her how to load, aim, and fire, his large hands guiding hers, the contact both practical and profoundly intimate. In that moment, he was no longer just fulfilling a contract, he was arming his partner, accepting her fully into the heart of the conflict. He was placing his trust, and his life, in her hands. The confrontation came as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and red. Marcus Thorne, having abandoned all pretense of legal maneuvering, arrived with 3 hired men, their faces hard and their intentions clear. They rode into the ranch yard, intent on taking the spring by force. Gideon met them in the open, a lone, immovable mountain of a man, his rifle held loosely at his side. Amelia watched from the porch, her own rifle cold and heavy in her hands, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Words were exchanged, short and sharp, but negotiation was a fantasy. The first shot was fired by one of Thorne's men, and the yard erupted into a chaotic symphony of shouts, gunshots, and the terrified bellowing of cattle. Gideon moved with a deadly grace, using the water trough for cover, his fury controlled and precise. He was a force of nature, a righteous storm of retribution. But in the swirling dust and chaos, he didn't see one of the men circle around the barn. The man raised his pistol, aiming squarely at Gideon's exposed back. Time seemed to stop. Amelia didn't have a clear shot. Without thinking, she dropped the rifle, seized the old, heavy brass school bell she had brought to the porch for decoration, and with a desperate cry, she swung it with all her might. It flew through the air, a spinning arc of bronze, and struck the gunman's arm with a sickening crack and a loud, discordant clang. The man screamed, his shot going wide. The sound of her old life saving her new one, gave Gideon the opening he needed. He disabled the man and, in a blind rage, turned on a disarmed Thorne. His hands went to Thorne's throat, but Amelia's voice cut through his fury. "Gideon! Don't! He isn't worth it." Her voice, a beacon of reason, pulled him back from the moral precipice, reminding him of the man he was, not the man Thorne had tried to make him. In the ringing silence that followed, as the dust settled and the vanquished men were bound, awaiting the sheriff Gideon's ranch hands had ridden for, the world seemed to shrink to the space between them. The raw, violent energy of the fight receded, leaving behind a profound and trembling clarity. Gideon walked towards Amelia, who stood on the porch, her hand still shaking. His face was bruised, a cut bleeding above his eye, but his gaze was clear, stripped of all its former shadows. He gently took the dented school bell from her grasp, his thumb tracing its brass surface. He looked from the bell to her face, his expression one of awe and dawning realization. "I built fences around this land," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "And I built fences around my heart. I thought I just needed an heir." He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. "But I was lost, Amelia. I was a ghost in my own home until you came." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his image. "And I thought I was content with my quiet life," she confessed in a whisper. "But it was an empty life. I was safe, but I wasn't living." He stepped closer, closing the final distance between them, his hands framing her face. "I offered you a home," he murmured, his forehead resting against hers. "But you, Amelia Vance, you gave me a life." In the fading light of the hard-won day, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of performance or of duty, but a desperate, searing vow of love, a sealing of their true and unbreakable union, forged in fire and loyalty. 6 months later, the prairie was reborn. The harsh, brown landscape of winter had surrendered to a vibrant carpet of green, dotted with the hopeful colors of spring wildflowers. Inside the Blackwood Ranch house, a similar transformation had taken place. The Spartan silence was gone, replaced by the soft crackle of a fire in the hearth, the scent of lemon and beeswax, and the quiet hum of a life being fully lived. The rooms that had once felt vast and empty were now filled with a comfortable warmth, with books and blankets and the promise of a future. Amelia sat in a rocking chair near the window, a book resting on her gently rounded stomach, a serene smile gracing her lips. The sunlight streamed in, illuminating the life growing within her. The door opened softly, and Gideon entered, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He was no longer a man haunted by shadows, his shoulders were relaxed, his eyes held a steady, gentle light. He crossed the room, knelt before her chair, and placed a large, reverent hand on her belly, a look of profound wonder on his face. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss full of shared history and unspoken promises. Outside, the garden they had planted together was beginning to sprout, tiny green shoots pushing their way through the dark earth. Theirs was a love story written not in poetic verses or grand pronouncements, but in quiet acts of courage, in the steadfast turning of two lonely souls toward the light. The practical arrangement had become their foundation, but the love that grew from it was as wild, beautiful, and enduring as the land itself. We hope the story of Amelia and Gideon has reminded you that love can be found in the most unexpected of circumstances, and that true strength is often found in the partnerships we forge. If you enjoyed their journey from a marriage of convenience to a bond of unbreakable love, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more emotional and inspirational stories. Your engagement helps us bring these narratives to life. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss a new release. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.